How are you guys this morning? I just realized I usually ask that, and I haven't asked that yet. How are you? Good. Welcome. Happy Sunday. It's good. It's good to be together with you guys. We are this summer in our Sunday gatherings. We are exploring the scriptures, specifically a theme, a core theme. It's core to everything in following Jesus and what it means to be a Christian and think like a follower of Jesus. It's a series where we're taking a tour through the New Testament about the importance of the resurrection of Jesus, about not just whether or not it happened, that's really important, but what it means and why it's significant. The empty tomb and the resurrection of Jesus was one of these things. If you read the 4 accounts of Jesus' life in the New Testament, it's not something that any of the disciples of Jesus saw coming. Even though Jesus talked about it, it was so outside of their frame of reference for the world and life that it was so surprising, and it so shattered everything they thought that they knew. What we're seeing in the New Testament is the apostles and the earliest followers of Jesus dismantle and rebuild everything that they think about God and the world and themselves in light of what happened on Easter morning. It required just a full deconstruction and reconstruction of their lives and their habits and their ways of thinking. And so that's what we're taking this summer, to touch down in every author in the New Testament, all of the apostles, all the different books of the New Testament, almost all, to explore what each one of these voices has to say about the meaning of the resurrection of Jesus. And so here we are. We're looking at the first paragraph of Peter. Now, if you came to Church in the Park, you discovered that Church in the Park, for the kind of short Bible study messages for that, what's that all about this summer? What book of the Bible? 1 Peter, and the theme of hope. So, you could call it a calendar miscommunication, or you could call it the Holy Spirit calling us all to really think about, because here we are. This paragraph is what's going to be unpacked also, even more depth at the next 2 weeks at Church in the Park. So apparently Jesus has something for us as a community here, although it might just be my calendar mistake. Anyway, one way or another, this is, holy cow, what a paragraph that was just read for us from 1 Peter chapter 1. I don't know, in our English translations, there are different ones that we read when we come together. It's one long, really, really complex flow of thought. In the language that Peter wrote, this paragraph, verses 1 through 9, it's actually one long run-on sentence. Your English grammar teacher would have a fit if you were ever to write a paragraph like what Peter wrote in Greek in verses 1 through 9. It's just one long sentence. And so most of our English translations end up carving it up into multiple sentences, but this is a dense paragraph worthy of many, many hours of exploration and prayer and meditation. Peter, as he's writing this letter, it's important to think about who he is. Why should we care what Peter says about the resurrection of Jesus this morning? So think about who Peter is. He's one of the first disciples. He's actually one of the first people who ever followed Jesus. If you know the story, he was fishing. He was one of these fishermen guys up in Galilee, and Jesus called him to follow him. And he was kind of something of a bumbling oaf, of a follower of Jesus as you read through the stories about him. He was one of the 2 disciples of Jesus who utterly betrayed Jesus in his moment of greatest need. Do you remember the story? Who was the other one? Judas, right? It's hard to forget him once you hear the story. But then Peter also had a triple betrayal of Jesus. That's Peter. On the night that Jesus was arrested. Peter was one of the disciples who, after the women disciples who discovered the empty tomb, Peter heard the report, and he was one of the first disciples on the scene to see the empty tomb and the nicely folded burial cloths sitting on the bench in there, and to wonder what it means. And he was among the first of what would become hundreds of eyewitnesses to encounter the risen Jesus. And so here we have Peter now. We're decades past all that, a couple decades. And Peter's become a leader and a missionary, and he's helped start churches all over the ancient world. And that he's writing to a circle of them, writing to a group of churches in what we would call modern-day Turkey, up near the Black Sea. And what he knows about these churches is that they're undergoing a really intense wave of persecution. We don't know exactly what. He mentions suffering and grief. He mentions imprisonment. Almost certainly, it's this. The early Christians were just very odd. The Greeks and the Romans had no clue what to do with them, because they didn't give their allegiance to Caesar, the Roman emperor, as divine, or give their allegiance to the Roman Empire as God's divine tool in the world. But they also weren't militant revolutionaries. They just were insistent on gathering together in these large public gatherings, singing hymns to Jesus as if he were God, and giving their allegiance to Jesus and Jesus alone. And they didn't go to the temples anymore, and it would be like dropping out of Christmas, 4th of July, and Thanksgiving for us, or something like that. They just dropped out of much of public life that was associated with worship of different Greek and Roman gods. And so the Christians were viewed with suspicion. What are they doing when they get together in their homes and eat these meals together? And it was so there'd be these outbreaks of suspicion and then violence towards Christians. It's still happening all over the world today. And so Peter knows this. And so he writes a letter to sustain the faith. He's a pastor. He's acting as a pastor who's trying to sustain the faith of these suffering Christians who are being made fun of, harassed, killed, and isolated in their cities. And what's the first thing that he brings up when he thinks of how can I help these followers of Jesus stay hopeful and sustain their hope? What's the first thing he brings up in the letter? The first sentence after introducing himself. We heard it read. He brings up the resurrection of Jesus. Not their hope of future resurrection, of them being raised. He'll talk about that later. It's Jesus' resurrection. So apparently for Peter, this is a really important tool in his pastoral toolkit. When you encounter a follower of Jesus who's suffered deeply and has had everything important in their life shattered and taken away from them, where do you direct their attention if you want to give them hope? And for Peter, he directs their attention back to what he saw and witnessed 20 some odd years ago, the empty tomb and the risen Jesus. And he makes very clear why he thinks that's the first place your heart and your mind should go when you're a Christian and you encounter suffering and hardship. And he's given us this incredible, incredible image here. That the resurrection of, he says, God's given us new birth into a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. It's verse 3. And we're just going to camp out on that for a little bit. The resurrection of Jesus is so momentous. It wasn't just an odd thing that happened to Peter one day. I guess some dead people do come back to life. What a strange place the world is. That's not the conclusion that they drew. The conclusion that Peter drew was, oh my gosh. The implications of Jesus doing that, and that he talked to him and saw him, and that Jesus was human, but yet a human that existed in a new and different kind of way that kind of freaked him out and freaked out everybody who met him, but also calmed them at the same time. And sometimes they fully recognized it was Jesus, but other times he seemed otherworldly, but it was very clear that he was fully human, right? It doesn't just mean the world's more stranger than it was the day before he saw the empty tomb. For Peter, this meant that the world's a totally different place than what he thought, and that God is someone whose purposes and plans for the world are way bigger than what he thought before, and that his own future hope was being reshaped in the process, that the future of the universe was being birthed before his eyes, and that the whole future of humanity was being redefined in light of what he saw there on Easter. That's how big this was for him. And he says that event has such world-shaping significance. He says, first of all, it's a hope. It gives followers of Jesus hope. It's dynamic. He says it's a living hope. So it's not just about an interesting historical event. It's a hope that's eternally present, with the capacity to change and transform your whole outlook on life. And if a follower of Jesus allows the resurrection to become that living hope, it does something to you. And he uses this image that he certainly got from hearing Jesus talk about it. It makes you into a new kind of human. The only language appropriate to talk about somebody whose life is being changed by the resurrection is to say, oh, that's somebody who's been born a second time. Born again. Which doesn't have the best associations in modern American culture right now. But for Jesus and Peter, this is an incredibly profound image. It's like the resurrection, if we let it, will make us into different humans who see the world a different way and who act a different way. It's the first place he directs the attention of these suffering, hurting Christians. Why? Why does he turn to hope? It's the first thing. The resurrection transforms you. That's the hope. He sets hope in front of these suffering, hurting people. Why does he do that? Well, Peter's a wise pastor, right? He's really wise. And he hung out with Jesus and heard Jesus teach, presumably, about every sermon and teaching that he ever gave. So I think that would make a person pretty wise. But Jesus knew something about humans, too, that Peter obviously picked up. And what Peter assumes here about humans and our need for hope, it's the same thing that the modern field of psychology has been telling us about human nature for whatever the last 150 years. And that's that human beings are unique in lots of different ways on planet Earth. But specifically, we're unique in this deep psychological need for hope. For hope. Human beings are very different than mountain lions, if you didn't know that. I'm sure that was obvious to you already. You're learning all kinds of things. Human beings are not mountain lions today. But, so how are they not like mountain lions? Mountain lions don't sit around in their dens wondering if other lions like them. Like, oh, yeah. Or like, what's going to happen to them after they die, right? And they don't have these anxious crises, existential crises of like what they wake up, I'm hungry, instinct, impulse, food. And mountain lions are on my mind a lot this summer. I'll tell you why a little later, but I got a chance to go to Central Oregon to a friend's property. And we were staying at a little cabin by Cougar Lake. And this friend was telling us about how many mountain lions have been seen and on the property, because there's a lot of elk on the property. And so, I'm there with my toddler sons for 5 days out on this ranch, and it's all I can think about. It's lions. We call them cougars and mountain lions, I think, to distance ourselves from the terrifying reality that they're lions. They're lions. Like, we live in a land that's full of lions still today, and we just don't want to think about it. We call them cougars or something. But so my son and I were on an ATV, actually, exploring one morning, and we go by, and all these vultures go up, and we go down, and we discovered 200 yards from our cabin this huge disemboweled deer, fresh, hours old, lion kill. And this was not good for me as a parent to know this, and so I was freaked out the whole rest of the time. That's why mountain lions is my example right now. I'm just telling you the backstory. So mountain lions. So that mountain lion didn't wake up in the morning like wondering if had meaning or purpose to its life. It was hungry, and it obliterated that deer for us to be looking at and be terrified, right? But so that's mountain lions. Humans have this different thing going on. We have this deep psychological need for our lives to be organized into a story so that the random events of our lives fit together in some kind of pattern of meaning that has a goal, that has some purpose in which we put our hope. And this is so vital to healthy human existence. And you know this on a deep level. You don't need a psychologist to tell you this. You know it on a deep level because when your own personal hopes and dreams are taken from you, we're reduced to nothing. There's no more significant voice in the last 50 years to remind us of this than a guy named Viktor Frankl. Do you guys know about Viktor Frankl? Do you know Viktor? He's a Holocaust survivor. He was a Jewish psychologist. He lived in Austria. Here you go. That's the young Viktor Frankl. And I looked on my preaching calendar, and it's been exactly 3 years since I brought up Viktor Frankl in a sermon. I should bring him up at least once a year because you need to. This is his short little paperback book will change your life forever. It is so profound. Half of it's his story, which is that he lived in a small town in Austria, which was, of course, captured by the Nazis. He was in his early 20s when the Nazis took over Austria. He was deported, he and his young wife, to Theresienstadt, a ghetto, where they were for almost a year, and then they were transported to the concentration camp in Dachau. And out of all of his friends and family, his wife, only he and one of his sisters survived out the other side after a total of 2.5 years of being captive to the Nazis. And half the book is just his story, which is just absolutely incredible. But then the second half of the book tells of what he learned. And part of it's all woven together in his story of survival. How he survived was by being true to his nature as an academic, which was he was a psychiatrist, just recently out of school, and he had been into his practice. And so he had to do manual labor like everybody. But what he would do in the evenings was actually act as a therapist. He would have sessions with people in the tents and in the camps in the evenings, and this became his way of finding some kind of meaning and purpose to his presence there. And it's very powerful. What he talks about was he would take all these observations and keep notes on people in these sessions. He would hide them in his mattress and so on. Total nerd, right? Right? This is how you stay alive in a concentration camp. You just become an academic and a psychologist to help, because he was so fascinated with how people were dealing with the trauma of the horror of life in a concentration camp. And in this one section, he talks about how the uniqueness of what's happening in a concentration camp is, of course, that this is the largest scale elimination of human beings at the hand of other human beings that's had ever been done before, and was so uniquely horrifying. But on the level of the kind of trauma it was, he said what life in a concentration camp did was it condensed a series of events that actually takes place for most people, almost everybody, just over a longer period of time. So you lose your home. You're taken from where your roots are. You lose loved ones and family members and friends. You lose the status that you once had, that came along with your career or job or your accomplishments. You lose freedom of movement. You lose your health. Right? This is actually something that's going to happen. News flash. It's something that's going to happen to all of us as we die. And what he makes this observation is what life in the concentration camp, it just condensed. What for most people gets strung out over years or even decades, it was all compressed into a year and a half for these people in the camps. And so what he became fascinated with was its effect, how people dealt with this. And the common denominator, he said, of the people who were able to survive in some kind of healthy way was exactly what Peter's talking about: hope. Hope. The ability to find a way that this series of events fit into a story that had some greater end or purpose. So he catalogs it in the first half of the book. He said some people, it's very clear, they lost hope altogether. This was senseless, random, there is no meaning. And he said the whole wave of people in the camps became animal. They became mountain lions, just violent, bitter, angry creatures of instinct, who their only goal in being awake was to survive. There was a whole other layer of people who dealt with the loss of hope through indifference and apathy. You just give up. You just numb and block everything out until your body gives out. And psychologically, this accelerated for many people. He tells a story of one guy who thought for certain that the war would be over within 6 months. And when that date came and went on the calendar, The next day he began a fever, and he died days later because of his loss of hope. He talks about people who survived psychologically through fantasy, and what they had stories about was how their loved ones it was all really okay, and that they were going to be able to go back home and see all their friends and loved ones and rebuild their wealth and career and so on. And so that kept people afloat like until they were liberated if they survived. But then he followed up with many of these people, and they would just crash and burn because none of those things actually happened. And so there's a small group of people, and he was included within this, who were able to survive and emerge out the other side in some kind of semi-healthy way. And it was all about hope. But it was people who had a hope that he talks about that transcended their circumstances. So he talks about like a baker whose hope was simply to bake bread for others again, or a musician who simply wanted to have the freedom and joy to play a piano or to play a flute again. For himself, it was simply to practice psychology and to help people in therapy. And it was something about this hope. It was real, and it couldn't be, like no one could take that from you. If you live through a concentration camp, unless you lose your arms, you can bake bread afterwards. It was this hope that couldn't be touched by their captors or by their circumstances. And that's where he lands, and then that's what he develops into a philosophy of life in the second half of the book. And it's very, very powerful. And it's exactly what he has his thumb on in this story, in his little story, it's precisely what Peter assumes about the human condition here. The first thing that he turns the attention of these suffering Christians to is hope. The hope that was opened up and revealed on Easter morning through the empty tomb and the appearance of the risen Jesus. And that hope can do something to you that's living and dynamic, can make you into a new kind of human. And Frankl would agree that hope has that same life-transforming kind of power. How then? So the million-dollar question is, how do I tap into this? Like, how do I access this? Why is it that for many of us, our experience of following Jesus, like you wouldn't use the words living hope and new humanity to describe how you felt when you woke up this morning? And when you hear the news of what's happening in our world or in your life. And so what Peter goes on to explore is just two things that I want to have us focus on. He explores the way to that new humanity that opens up because of this living hope. It's precisely by not denying the tragedy and suffering of our lives or our world, but it's by embracing and letting it engulf us and transform us. And that somehow we come out the other side, people of profound wisdom and joy, who are not crushed by our sufferings, but actually made into more beautiful humans through it. How does that happen? Well, look at what he says in this next sentence after he talks about the new birth and the living hope. He uses a financial metaphor to talk about what that hope is. He calls it an inheritance. Do you see that in verse 4? He says, in God's mercy, this is verse 3, he's given us new birth into a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus from the dead and into an inheritance. And what kind of an inheritance? It cannot perish, it cannot spoil, it cannot fade. It's an inheritance that's kept in heaven for you, who through faith are shielded by God's power until the coming of the salvation. So what he's saying is precisely what Frankl said humans need to survive. Just hope. And he uses this image of money in the bank. He says, if you're a follower of Jesus, you've got a big stock of cash in the bank, an inheritance. And it cannot be touched by anyone or anything or any life circumstance. It can't spoil, perish, or fade. and it's kept in heaven, which doesn't mean for Peter that's where you're going to go to get it. What he means is it's kept, the point is it's in God's keeping. And when God, and through the return of Jesus, comes here, when the salvation is revealed, you're going to get your inheritance. That's the idea here. So you've got the money in the bank that cannot be touched. We're talking here about hope, the kind of hope that's necessary for human beings to see their loss and their tragedies as a meaningful part of a story going towards a goal. That's what's accessible to a follower of Jesus. And no one or no thing can take it away from you. It's the kind of thing that can transform a human's experience of loss and suffering in life. He says that's what it is. It's accessible. And it's eternal. And it's not going anywhere. It's not going to change. And here's what's interesting. So the inheritance and the hope, that's not going to change, but you are going to change. If you have this as your hope, then you're going to change a lot. It won't change. You're going to become a different kind of person as you hold on to that hope. And he develops this next metaphor that's really so powerful of what it's like to be a follower of Jesus, holding on to that hope opened up by the resurrection, and to go through a life of suffering and grief. Look at the things he holds together here. So he says in verse 6, in all of this, you greatly rejoice. You've got money in the bank. You happy about that? It's good news. So there's that. So you have this posture of joy. Well, what happens to you? As you suffer grief in all kinds of trials. So what he's saying, this is very intuitive as you wake up every day here on planet Earth. Life here is very difficult for all of us, and especially for some. And so there's that, like that reality. But he says, if I hold on to this living hope, what is my basic posture and attitude as I go through daily life? He says it here in verse 6, joy. He says it down again in verse 8. You're filled with inexpressible and glorious joy. Now stop and think about that. If you have a friend who just experienced a horrible, tragic loss of someone they love or something they care about deeply, and you go and you go like give them a call and you take them out for a cup of coffee or whatever, and you're like, how are you doing? They're like, oh, I'm great. I'm doing just great, full of joy. Your first thought would be, oh, this is a very unhealthy person, right? It's a very emotionally unhealthy person that's suppressing their real feelings, right? They're clearly in a state of denial, and right? Are you with me? That's what you would think. So I'm certain that's not what Peter's talking about here, right? This isn't like you go through kind of what he calls grief and suffering and trials, and it's just, well, turn that frown upside down. You're a follower of Jesus, so just grin and bear it and chin up and that kind of thing. So let's just pause here. This is very important because that is how some people think Christians ought to respond to suffering. How did Jesus respond to his most intense night of grief and fear and suffering? In the Garden of Gethsemane, how did Jesus, when he looked into the face of knowing that he was going to be brutally executed, that all of his friends were going to abandon him, some of them, like Peter, were going to betray him, and he's on his knees in the Garden of Gethsemane, is Jesus laughing? Do you know the story? He's so overwhelmed with grief and sorrow, he doesn't even have words. The only words he has are the words that he was raised on of the poems of lament from the Hebrew Scriptures, which is what he quotes. He can't even verbalize his own grief, so he uses the Scriptures to voice his own grief as he's weeping. But then you watch this transformation in Jesus where he chooses hope, right? He commits his life and his future into the Father's hands because he knows that they are working together this very night as partners to do something about the human condition. And so he ends in this place of trust and hope. Father, not my will, but your will be done. And here we go. This is what we're talking about. So what Peter's talking about is a deep choice that I make. That because I trust in this event of the empty tomb and the risen Jesus, that unlocked a living hope that can't be taken from me no matter what. What I choose is in the face of suffering, I choose hope and I choose joy, which doesn't mean that I'll feel happy, but it does mean I choose to believe that this tragedy doesn't have the last word in my life or in God's good world. And that kind of choice and hope, it changes the person in a really significant way. And that's unpacked by the metaphor he uses here. He used a banking metaphor. Then he uses a metalsmith metaphor. Did you see it? He says, when you choose joy through trust and faith in God's promise and in the resurrection, he talks about what happens to a person when they choose that and as they go through the pain of loss and tragedy. It's this image of fire and metal, right? Your faith is of greater worth than gold, which perishes even though it's refined by fire. Now, I don't know. There are some metalsmiths in Portland. There's actually one off 20th and Hawthorne, not far from here, back in this garage. You know Cinemagic, the movie theater? You know, there's that weird garage door. If you've ever wondered what's behind that, I grew up near there, so since a little boy, I've always wondered what's beyond that garage door. So there's someone who's was going here to Door of Hope. He's a metalsmith. There's a metalsmith shop back there. It's really cool. Anyhow, I don't know anything about metalsmithing. You know what I mean? I grew up on skateboarding and graffiti and Twinkies. You know, I don't know anything about this. So I know as much as you do through movies about medieval Europe or something like that. But so just work with me here. So I think this is how the process works. I'm pretty sure. This is what Wikipedia, Encyclopedia Britannica tells me. So you mine out metal. How do you make a sword or a shield or a suit of armor or something? Right? So you have to mine and get these elements out of the earth. You go into a mine and you dig out whatever, steel or iron. He uses a precious metal as his example, gold. And if you get that out of the earth, right, you have, the metal, right, the element, a big chunk of it. You call them nuggets, I guess, right? Nuggets or something. So, right, that. But if it comes from the earth, it's also shot through and all veined and lined through with what? With dirt, with rock, right, as the thing composed under pressure, and I have no idea how that process works. So whatever, all the same, you have this. So what do you do, right? So you take it into the blacksmith shop and you melt this thing down. You get this metal so hot that it liquefies it. And then all of a sudden, it's liquid, and then these impurities, the rock, the sediment, right, it floats. It's floating loose. And you can't use a kitchen strainer because that'll melt it, but there's some process of straining all that. You guys know what I'm talking about? Even if you've never seen it, you know what I mean? You've seen some movie where we have to remake the sword and they melt it down and that kind of thing. So it's like that. So think of this, but it's heat. It's intense heat that reduces this metal to its most basic, essential state. And by that process, but you would think you're destroying it, right? You're putting it into the fire, and it's reduced, right, to liquid. But you're actually not destroying it. What you're doing is making it possible to remove everything that doesn't belong to this metal's essence. And you strain all of that out, and then you pour it into a mold, and you get a sword or a brick of silver or gold, and it's pure. Do you see? That's the image he's using right here. So the resurrection of Jesus makes it possible to have a living hope that is so transformative that the experiences of deep pain and suffering and loss, like the kind of loss that Frankl talked about, of losing, that all of us will undergo, of losing everyone that is important to you, and everything that you love, and all of the things and accomplishments that give our lives meaning and purpose, our bodies, like it's all going to go. And the resurrection apparently invites us to see that process as a strange gift, an unwelcome, unpleasant gift that transforms you into a new and different kind of human. And it doesn't mean denial. Jesus was not in denial about what was about to happen to him. He was fully aware and engaged, and he embraced it. But it did something to him, and it does something to us. If you've ever spent time around a grandparent or a great-grandparent, somebody who's lived a long time and has seen a lot of loss, and if they've allowed that loss to make them into people who are humble and wise, you know what I'm talking about. Like suffering and loss is this strange teacher in the human experience. And if I have a living hope, it paradoxically turns into a gift. Why? Well, think of what's happening, what Frankl talks about. These people who turn to fantasy, the only way they could survive is to re-envision that somehow I'm going to get all of these people back that I've lost, or I'm going to get back those seasons of life and those experiences that I once had that brought me great joy. What's happening there? What's happening is that we're locating in a person, in another person in our lives. We're locating in our job or our career accomplishments. We're placing a burden on those people and on those seasons of life, a burden that they actually can't bear. And that is to give our lives true meaning and purpose. And the stripping away and losing of people and seasons of life, like, it's very painful because why is it? Why? It's putting a spotlight on all of the false identities and the false hopes that we accumulate as we go through life. Life is very difficult. And so people come along the way that become so dear and important to us, we actually think they are the key to me surviving. But they're not. They're going to die. And I'm going to die. And I have to have a way to reckon with that. And this is something that's so uniquely powerful about a Christian worldview. It allows me to not deny that loss and pain, but to embrace it, not in a sadistic, weird way, but in a way that says I'm able to receive these people in my life and receive that season of life that was so wonderful in a way that is open-handed. That was a gift. That was a gift. But it is not a gift that determines who I am. It's not my essence. I love my children and my family so dearly, but I cannot ask them to become my hope because I will have to part with them one day. They cannot be my hope. They are not my essence of my identity as an individual. And so what the resurrection of Jesus, if it means anything, it means that there is someone who is committed to me and whose love and commitment to me transcends the grave, and it transcends that suffering. And it allows me to hold with an open hand these wonderful, wonderful things in my life that I am tempted to turn into gods and turn into idols and make them my hope. And they will disappoint, Peter says, because they don't last. And anybody who's lived a long time on planet Earth can tell you that. Which brings us all the way back around to this image of hope. Somehow hope can help me see my losses as a human as this gift that's stripping away my false hopes. It's kind of like, I know I've been talking about mountain lions a lot lately, if you've been around the last couple of months. One is I went to that ranch a couple weeks ago. Another is I went last month on an annual backpacking trip that I do with a group of friends. We've been doing it for years now. And we do a different national park, 5 days and 30 to 50 miles in different national parks around the country. And I remember my first year, it was a number of years ago, I had never done this long of a trek before. I had just done like weekend backpacking trips. And so my first year, it was a difficult lesson to learn. And because I packed all this stuff that I truly did not need. I packed a large hardback book because I was certain that I would have these existential moments reading to a sunrise, over this and kind of, but I was so exhausted, I missed all the sunrises because I slept through them. So there was never those moments. I put a rubber band around a fork, a spoon, and a knife that I got out of our silverware drawer. I was like, I'm going to need some silverware, do that. Extra pants, way too much trail mix, this kind of thing. And so by day 4 and mile 38, I'm hurting. I'm feeling each one of those utensils made of metal, and I'm feeling the 3 days of extra trail mix that I don't need. My shoulders. I can tell you what muscles were feeling those extra pounds. You're feeling it. And so in a very difficult way, this is a trivial example, but it makes the point. In a trivial way, that pain became the greatest gift to me because it motivated me to save up and buy this that weighs virtually nothing, this titanium spork. And I let somebody else carry their own knife, and I just use theirs, sucker, let him carry the weight. And I don't need a knife. What do I need a knife for? There's 6 of us, and so, who needs extra pants? You just use the convertible pants, and you just need one pair, and that kind of one extra pair of underwear is really helpful, that kind of thing. So it became this teacher, right? It was painful. It was really painful. It became my teacher. And it's that. It's not that I loved the pain. It's not like, bring it on. It's not unhealthy. It's allowing and embracing that experience for what it was and to become a gift, to teach me. And that's exactly what Peter's saying here about suffering and pain and loss. And so all of it begs the question. It's something that I didn't point out at the beginning. But as we conclude, it's the question that we ought to be asking. It's all the way back at the beginning. How is it that this living hope that can change and transform us in how we encounter loss and suffering, how is all of that emerge out of out of the resurrection of somebody else from the dead? That's great for Jesus that he rose from the dead. How is that my hope? Why doesn't Peter say, you've been given new birth into a living hope through your own hope in your resurrection from the dead? But he doesn't say that, does he? It's implied, but that's not what he says. Somehow my ultimate hope actually isn't even just in my own personal destiny. My hope is outside of myself in something that was done for me. And it's not just me whistling in the dark, and it's not just pie in the sky. It's as real as the empty tomb and as the Jesus who emerged out of that tomb on Easter morning. Why does Jesus' resurrection give me that kind of dynamic hope? And to answer that question, we turn right to the thing that we're about to do, is to take the bread and the cup together. Right? Jesus, on that night that Jesus was betrayed by Peter, as he looked into the face of intense suffering, what Jesus went through in those 24 hours was a condensed form of what Frankl went through in those 2.5 years, which was itself a condensed form of what we all are going to go through or are going through as our lives age and come to an end. Right? Jesus lost everybody he loved. The people, he lost his life, he lost his dignity, and the people that he actually thought were committed to him, it turns out were not. Why did he do that? Why did he knowingly walk into all of that? And what he said at that last meal, that Passover meal, he took these symbols of bread that he broke and of a cup that he drank and shared, and he said, this is me. This is my body, this is my blood. I'm going to die, and it's for you. It's for others. Jesus believed that as he stared into the dark night of his suffering, that he was looking into the human condition. that he's binding himself to the tragic human story. And it's the human story that's always going on. It just becomes really acute and intense to us like it has in the last 30 days. And Jesus believed he was taking and participating taking into himself all of the consequences of the sin and the selfishness and the violence and the ways that we do behave like mountain lions to each other. He takes it all into himself and he allows it to destroy him and kill him. Why did he do that? And he made it as clear as he could in the years that he was teaching. Because the meaning of God's essence, the meaning of who he revealed God to be, the meaning of our existence is love. Is love. It's suffering, sacrificial love for the well-being of another. Jesus loves our world. He loves our world. In the state that it's in, he loves our world. So much that he would take its own suffering and death into himself. So much that he would overcome it with his own creative love and life. He became what we are so that we can become what he is. And that's why the empty tomb, the cross is for us, and the empty tomb and his risen existence is for us. It unlocks for me just not my own personal destiny beyond death. It's the future of the universe walked out of that tomb on Easter morning. The future of humanity. And it forces us, it puts a spotlight and challenges us to ask, what's our true hope? What am I really hoping in? What are the people and the things in my life that actually are my true hope? And I know that because when they're threatened, I become undone. And so as we come to the bread and the cup, I think the challenge to us is to examine what our real hope is. Are my hopes in someone or something that ultimately will destroy them and destroy me and let me down? Or is my hope in a place that is secure and eternal and that cannot be touched by any life circumstance? That's the question that Peter puts to us this morning. Let me close in a word of prayer.